Hey, so hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. My name's Stephen Tulip. I'm the UK Country Manager for ACT, the App Association. Now, most companies in the UK are SMEs, and if you go past any industrial estate across the land, you'll find small businesses developing incredible new technologies and driving innovation, employing people and generally contributing to their local economy. Their products make our home and work lives better, and without these small businesses, we'd be a lot worse off than we are. The companies that you'll hear from today are just a snapshot of that SME brilliance. We'll start the event by hearing in turn from App Association members Manulytica, Goldilock, and Infrafon about their technologies, impact, and journey. We'll then have a roundtable discussion about how standards generally impact the business before moving on to discuss a specific corner of the standards world, standard essential patents. We also have a sprinkling of experts on the panel to add context and colour to our discussion. Now, some of you might be new to the area of standards and standard essential patents, or SEPs in short. Some of you are no doubt experts. For the newbies, here is a very, very simplified description of why they're important. A standard essential patent, or a SEP, is a type of patent that must be licensed by companies seeking to implement certain standardized wireless communication technologies in their products. 5G, for example, or newer Wi-Fi standards. In a nutshell, if you want to make an IoT product that connects wirelessly to the world around it, somebody somewhere probably has to pay to license the necessary standard essential patent. Now, it's been a busy couple of weeks in SEP land with the shockwaves caused by the UK High Court decision on the InterDigital versus Livono case, which we'll talk about later, and the launch by the Intellectual Property Office of an SME-focused questionnaire to gather their views on the current SEP licensing landscape. I think this is a great development because it makes it easier for small companies to share their views, which is something that I think is crucial in the development of good policy. We at the App Association believe that SMEs are crucial to the UK's ambition to be a science and technology superpower by 2030, and that the state of standards policy has a significant impact on SMEs' ability to thrive. We believe that fair access to standard essential patents in particular is a real enabler of SME innovation, and there's a prime opportunity for the UK to take a lead in creating legislation that protects SMEs from unfair SEP licensing practices and enables them to access the technologies they need to create exciting new products that interoperate with the world around them. Now, we absolutely believe in the value of IP and that the people who own it should be able to profit from it. We do, however, think that this shouldn't come at the cost of leveraging the limited resources of SMEs to overcharge them for technologies that they need to innovate exciting new products. So we hope you find this event interesting. And if you've got any questions, the Q&A is open throughout. You can pop your questions in there and we'll endeavour to answer them live. And if we can't, we can respond by text once the speaker in question has finished talking. Just to quickly introduce our panel, in no particular order, we're joined by Ansley Ward, who's a partner and intellectual property litigator at WilmerHale Law Firm. She is absolutely one of those experts I was talking about. Also, my colleague, Priya Nair, who's our IP policy counsel at the App Association. And again, she really knows her stuff and will be taking over moderation of the technical discussion later in the event. Now, next up, I'm going to very, very briefly introduce our members because, to be honest, they can do a far better job of telling you what they do than I can. So we have Stephen Kynes, who is COO of Goldilock. We have Brian Wild, who's Chief Technology Officer of Infrafon, and William Fish, who is founder of Manulytica. Now, Will, you are up first, so I'm going to hand over to you to tell us about the things you're working on.
So I'll try to share screen and hopefully it's going to come up nicely. There we go. So a little bit about Manulytica, the clues in the name, manufacturing and analytics. So we're very much focused on technology within the manufacturing industrial sector, as we have that little tagline of making things smarter, as lots of industrial machinery performs a function. And there's lots and lots of interesting technology in there. There we go. But if we look at it, a lot of it's outdated equipment that does perform a single function. There's not a lot of interconnectivity in there. It's very closed systems and it performs critical processes. But with the way the world's going, a lot of people have even like a Nest thermostat in their house and they can control the temperature of their house when they're on the other side of the planet, where you've got multi-million-pound organizations that have no idea what's happening on the shop floor and really struggling with legacy equipment. So that's kind of where we come in, and we look at that focus to be able to work on that. And so when we talk about industrial equipment, a survey done in the States found that the average equipment is over 20 years old. So pre-internet days. And so bringing it all on board is going to take a little bit of effort. But as you can see, it's a big market. People are really moving in that direction. It's about a 40% year-on-year combined growth rate. So there's a lot of sort of action happening there. So we look at this and we say there's the three myths of digital transformation, especially the heavy industry. A, it has to be greenfield. I can't do it with my existing equipment. I have to buy the new modern equipment to be able to do this. No. It always takes a significant expense and planning and lots of effort to do it, because you're having to do all these changes to existing. With the way we're doing it, we don't think you do. We think it's nice and straightforward, and you have to replace what you have. We don't think you do. Now, the reason why it's really difficult is because if we look at the topic, the standard essential patents, and the way that we do interconnectivity, currently there's lots of different industrial ways of doing it. So as you can see on the top right, all those different methods, which are again are all closed systems. You have to buy into the way they're doing it. But we're trying to build everything open at Manulytica. We like to have not just open standards, but we like to use open source software and contribute to the open source community. Now, just give you an idea of some of the examples here. We're looking about £175 billion market for the automation, and IIoT is looking at about 4.5 billion, reaching 22 billion pretty soon. So it's a big market. A lot of the world's looking at it. So where does our bit come in? So the reason why we're involved with the App Association and the ACT group is our piece as a universal sensor needs to be able to read a lot of the existing standards used in industry, but we also use wireless. So we have to cater for Wi-Fi. We do 2G, 3G, 4G, and we've got a burgeoning 5G one, but that's not just to communicate to the cellular network externally. It also builds an internal network. So we currently use the same bandwidth you would for Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and we do have use of their standards, but we're also working on a private 5G network that it can work on. But of course, it involves having to deal with a whole bunch of different standards for just the radios, and then the standards for accepting communication from sensors and controllers, and trying to make this work globally. There's a lot of intersection of all those pieces. So it's really important for us that we have not just open ability to use it, but we then don't find one of the big players is saying really interesting technology, but you have interrupted and used some of our IP. So it's really important to us that that works. And then once we get that information, we also then work on data standards as well. So we're pulling it into what we call the UDX, the Universal Data Exchange, where we can then work with that and we consolidate that information to be able to build AI models so that we can take our device and build artificial intelligence tool that will take the data that's being captured and created on the legacy equipment that could have been designed and built in the 1990s, where it will realize that under certain conditions, it needs to modify its behavior so it can slow a motor down, speed a motor up, warm up some glue, do all these changes without making any changes to the underlying control system that currently exists. They'd have to reprogram it, so there's no safety issues. And we try to work through that one. And that essentially is Manulytica.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Well, and I must say that through my career, I visited must be close to 100 different factories. And the one thing they all have in common is that old bit of brown or dark green colored legacy equipment in the corner that is just as essential to the operation as the shiny new stuff.
And we find it's the very big, very expensive piece of equipment, which is it's a crucial piece to the whole operation. And they say, wouldn't it be nice and the expense of fixing it sometimes just becomes prohibitive. And I have a sort of story that was one of those moments where I sort of stopped and said, there's got to be a better way. I was working with a large global manufacturer, and they had a device which essentially was a conveyor belt, but it had Windows 95 machine that ran it. And it was, nobody wanted to touch it, but it needed upgrading because it was a huge risk. And the price of repairing it was unbelievable. So it's like, it's got to be a better way. So that's what we're working on.
Perfect. No, I can imagine. And actually, what you've done there is very, very neatly segued into Stephen, because that machine working on Windows 95 on the factory floor is why I think manufacturing is the third most targeted sector for cyber security. And our next speaker, Stephen, is somebody who knows all about that and has a innovative new solution to it.
Yeah, thank you very much. You're right. It's actually a very good segue, because when you have that connection and that ability, one of the things that we realize is that the best way to ensure the security, especially in operational technology sector, is to be able to control that cyber attack surface. And so, similar to William, we took a simplicity approach to cybersecurity by building a hardware device. And simply by being able to connect or disconnect anything from anywhere in seconds without using the internet. So that's the subject of our multi-patent technology. And as a hardware cybersecurity company, we deal with both the IT and OT networks. So in operational technology, especially what William's speaking about, is of a bigger concern. We ensure that the level of protection, because our critical national infrastructure is heavily under attack in this sort of state of cyber unpeace that we are facing in the global political climate with China and Russia, and nation state attacks threaten our factories. That kind of what William was referring to in terms of that digital twinning, the ability for factories to do the virtualization, needs to be controlled in many ways. And also with quantum and AI computing, this becomes a bigger issue. And we've been having effectively some forms of technology that is just layers and layers of software that doesn't actually deal with the critical problem, which is the connection. And so what we did was we simply went back to the drawing board and used a non-IP, which is the source of our patents, for a disconnect. So it's a full physical disconnect. It's the equivalent of pulling a cable. And where this can be used in things like factories, critical national infrastructure, water utilities, energy companies, is in one way is to think of it as a big red button, simply pulling the cables, which is the most secure form. The second is that to have a default scenario where you're actually having a scenario where you're disconnected, and many of the legislations, we see Singapore coming in July mandating this actually to be the case, that you have to have a default disconnect and only connect when it is necessary. And that's where we're moving towards. We should not be having our devices on throughout the networks, especially when you're meshing together OT and IT networks together. And the third, which is a middle ground, is having a lights out scenario that keeps it offline during scheduled times. Where we're focusing on part of our newest device that we've built has been built together with the Ministry of Defense. So it is certainly our level of focus. Some of these devices are with Ukraine. We work with protecting their assets there. But critical infrastructure, anywhere where you see data, it could be something as simple as SCADA systems, serial ports, all the way up to fiber. So these are some of the companies that we deal with. This is a little bit of a competitor analysis to understand that we're the only ones that have that patented technology that allows for the non-IP control, which is the real sort of secret sauce of how we deal with things. Because as long as you're using some sort of software layer, you're going to be able to be attacked, and it's going to be hackable. So these are some of the things that they say about what we've done, and we were chosen on the National Cybersecurity Center program, and together with working with the Ministry of Defense. So we're also talking about where we operate and what we do to the economy. So we are a UK company, despite my Canadian accent. We are based in Wolverhampton. I'm not going to give you a Wolverhampton accent, but I can assure you that our R&D and production facility and all our parts are sourced from NATO allied countries. We build it all ourselves. It's a full center there. It's a very important part of the West Midlands ecosystem for us to be close to the factories, and for us to be close to also critical national infrastructure and being the heart of research and development. So this is what we do now in an attack scenario, and this is what we believe is the future. And so our technology, our idea is that we will shrink the form factor so small that we'll be able to embed it directly in any device, so that you will be able to remotely disconnect and control your cyber attack surface from wherever, and eventually that includes also your home. So that's a whistle stop. That's a little bit of our game plan for the future. So we've already built these forms, and we've also have built a version in keeping with our current audience in SMEs. We also have a version which we provide to SMEs on a hardware as a service sort of leasing model to make it affordable for cybersecurity. What this device is a plug and play. So it's very similar, simple to use. So I will stop sharing and say thank you very much, and leave it to questions afterwards if anybody has any.
Great. No, thank you, Stephen. It's I must say, one thing that does come to mind is with the recent developments in AI, I'm all for any additional ways of pulling the plug just in case it does all go slightly wrong in a Skynet sort of way. But but you make a good point as well. I think, one of the things people often don't consider when they're thinking about how important small businesses are to the economy is that it's not just the people that you are hiring yourself. You use local local or regional suppliers for your products, or you're using local businesses to do your HR and to do your accounts and that sort of thing. So it's never just one business making a clever product. It's one business that's supporting several more businesses around it. And I think it's that's what
I would actually just want to emphasize how important that is, because our device is a very simple drawbridge that allows for but so it's a pass-through device. It's not a storage. It doesn't do any of the intrusion detection. So that was why it was very important we were part of the National Cybersecurity Center's program on ransomware, because of working with other companies. Like we work with a company called Prism, which does data sharding. We work with different companies that can provide the level of cyber resilience that is really important to protect us, because the reality of critical national infrastructure attacks is ultimately in the next 2 years is loss of life. So we need to be aware that this is not just about us losing credit card details or something. This is serious. We've seen South Staffordshire water attack this past summer. We've seen what's happened in Florida water, where there's the actual poisoning of water. You extrapolate that with the crazies that are out there right now, running some countries and invading places and doing all sorts of stuff like that. It doesn't take a big leap for that. I mean, we've seen North Korea take 1.7 billion in crypto assets last year alone of theft. What do they think they're going to be doing with that $1.7 billion worth of money? I would love if it was feeding their population, but I'm afraid it's not.
Yeah, no, the cyber warfare stuff is something that I think most of us like to pretend isn't happening, but it absolutely is. It's a top priority, and I think, really great.
I would make a clarification. I think we're not actually yet in a state of cyber war. We're in a state of what we call cyber unpeace. So we are cyber is a very unusual state because it is a form of disruption that doesn't involve overt war yet. I mean, there could be a cyber war, but I know it's a little bit of a nuance. That's a lawyer in me, but unpeace is a state of the fact that we are not in war, but we're obviously not in peace, and that it helps understand the way cyber sits within the whole disinformation space and disruption of our society. That is not an overt attack directly that we don't see, because a lot of people will then say, yeah, I don't really feel that we're being attacked, and that's because, yeah, you don't know it, because it is, as any form of theft. I mean, we have more skilled lawyers on the call that can tell that the difference between theft and robbery is a use of force, and theft is a form of stealing of our assets without us knowing about it. And unfortunately, a lot of our factories are experiencing that without them knowing. So that's the native cyber disruption.
Stephen, it's also I get similar questions, which is I can give them a good level of security on the device and on the network internally, and I say, as soon as you go to the internet, it's the Wild West out there. I think you're secure, but you need somebody like you to have that kill switch or some other intrusion detection. I can just say, I've got a secure connection from someone I think I trust, but I can manage your OT network. But once you go out to the big wide world, you're on your own.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I didn't show you the user interface, but it's actually an audit trail. So it knows, so picking up on that point, William, is that you actually see every connection that ever happens. So if you think about exactly what you just said, you have no idea of all that connection that's happening. So with us, with this sort of, I did get into the whole idea of network physical segmentation. When you segment that out, you can actually then control and see exactly who's connected when to which part of the network. And that gives us a better overview to allow us to manage those attacks.
Oh, excellent. And yeah, please, if anyone's got any questions, let us know. And if we've got time at the end, we can get back into it as well. Brian, we'll hand over to you next, if that's okay, sir.
Sure. So Brian Wild, I'm the CTO of Infrafon. We make smart devices. The security question is an interesting one, which we'll talk about as well, because we've had some dealings with that. Let me see if I can make this work. Everybody else managed, and now,
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, is that good? Okay, so Infrafon is, despite my accent, it's not actually a UK-based company, but the UK is one of the markets for our systems. Basically, we're producing a smart device. So we're definitely in the IoT space. It's like a badge you would have for going to a company when you get a printed paper badge, or you might get an NFC card to like open doors. The idea is this is a smart badge, so it does the same thing. You have your picture, you have the information about you, but because it's smart, it can update, it can send you messages, you can reply to the messages with a touchscreen, so you're always connected when you're on site. And there's a lot of markets for that. The idea is it's credit card size, it's light, so you can carry it in your neck as a normal path. It's not running Android or iOS, it's running an embedded OS. And interestingly, for the security aspect, that's also quite important, because that means you can actually audit the entire hardware and software of this device, unlike, for example, a smartphone, where you'd have a lot of trouble to say there are no backdoors on Android or iOS that can be used. The software on this device is small enough, embedded enough, that you could have an audit of every piece of line of code in that and say, yes, there are no backdoors in there. And that's important for some of our customers, especially when you're talking about tracking people or using their personal information. It's part of a system, so it doesn't live on its own. It's intrinsically connected by radio. So we talk to a backend server to do MQTT, to talk to whatever application you're running, whether it's visitor control or employee information systems, task management for workers, whatever. You got to have a backend, so it's got to talk to that backend over radio, which makes it part of an overall network which has security and operational considerations. Tons of use cases for Smart Badge, which I won't bore you with right now, but pretty much anywhere where you're talking about identifying people and what they're doing and want to communicate with them, then you can use this kind of device. Like I said, it's very communicative architecture. Let me just find the interesting thing, of course, when we're talking about essential patents, is the question of what kind of, what's it got inside it. When you talk about the technology that's inside this kind of smart device, you've got technology which is patented by the company producing it. For example, we use an e-ink, e-paper screen in order that the battery that's inside it can keep it going for several days. So that is technology which is patented by the e-ink corporation, but that's not the standard. There's no standard about how that e-paper works. On the other hand, we've got ESP32, so that's got a Wi-Fi block in it. Wi-Fi, there are many patents about the Wi-Fi system, and that's where we talk about standard essential patents, because Wi-Fi is a standard governed by the Wi-Fi Alliance. So in order to be on a Wi-Fi network, you have to use that technology, and therefore you have to use technology that is covered by those patents. That's why it's essential. You cannot use Wi-Fi without using the technology in that patent. So inside here we have Wi-Fi, we have Bluetooth, we have an LTE, so that's a 4G network for M2M. We also have radio systems that are not standards in the sense of international. We have, for example, a Semtech LoRa system, that's a LoRa radio, and there are patents about that as well, but these are owned by the company that provide us with the LoRa chip. So they're not an international standard. There are not other patents that come in on that. They're owned by the company who are supplying us with the chips. As you can see, it's quite dense. We have lots and lots of technology in there, all bundled into a very small, small device, and there must be so many patents involved in what's inside this, you wouldn't even be able to start counting them. We also have the system is designed to be robotized, so you can have a self-service kiosk where you come and log in as you do when you go to McDonald's, or perhaps went to a hospital. You might log in and say, okay, yes, I'm the visitor, I'm going to see Dr. So-and-so, and the machine would spit you out an Infrafon already loaded with all your details, where you've got to go, perhaps a map of where you've got to go. It would track you in the hospital, and it would alert you if your appointment was delayed. It would tell you, okay, now you're going to radiography, and that would allow them to both keep tabs on you, make sure you've been to all your appointments, and ask you questions. It might send you an alert and say, okay, the doctor's had to go somewhere else, so please go to this appointment now. So while you're on the site, you're using this as your communication device to keep up with what's going on and with their back-end application. And then when you leave, you go back to dispenser, you put it back in, it wipes all of your personal data. And that way you're not lying about any of your data that you were using while you were on the site. It's been securely wiped from the system, and you can go home knowing that there's none of that left, either on pieces of paper in the site, or for cases where you're using an app on a smartphone, that it's not sitting on your smartphone doing something else you don't know what it's doing. You only use it when you're on site, gives you all the same functionalities, and you don't need to worry about what else is it doing. I mean, it's pretty much there's various versions, different adaptions. When this is for a smart badge, you might have one that's with a version that's for doctors with a top screen like pager type device. Basically, it's about giving you the information you need when you're out and about on a site. And like I say, to do that, we have all this patented technology that's sitting inside this, allowing it to do its job. And some of those technologies are standards, and that's why we're here to talk about the standard essential patents. Any questions? Any questions about the system or whatever? Then I'm available at the end. I should say that I have several patents in my name from when I worked at telecom companies or my previous startups. So I know what it's like to have invented something and to have a patent on that technology, and obviously then want to be able to exploit the effort that went into that. But there are definitely a question of where it's a line between something I've put my work into, getting the money back on that, and getting unreasonable gains. I have many opinions on that subject. So, Stephen.
No, brilliant. Thank you, Brian. No, I know we're looking forward. Yeah, that comes later in the agenda where you get into minutes. Would you mind stopping sharing the slides, please? Is that okay?
There we go.
No, I mean, I think it's a really interesting technology, isn't it? I mean, it's got applications for safety and efficiency as well. I had a family member in hospital recently, and you lose hours trying to find them as they get moved around. It was across 9 floors, different departments, and you're taking up, valuable medics' time by them just ferrying people to where they need to be. So I think it's really important. And I think having that information on there as well helps with, people in factory environments where you can't go into certain areas because of secrecy, or you can't go into certain areas because of hazardous materials, whatever it might be. So yeah, really, really interesting technology. And it's kind of as well.
Yeah, and it fits back into the security aspect, because some of the security is about bad actors wanting to do things in operational environments. Some of it's also just general privacy laws, the security about your private information, where you were in the hospital at what time. Is that your information, or does that belong to the hospital? And there are now, of course, legal frameworks about that. So you have to be able to, when you're collecting that information or using it to optimize the process, be able to be sure that that information doesn't get out, because it's both a security risk for you, but also a legal exposure risk for your privacy compared to privacy law.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I think actually it's one of those things that you never really consider how outdated it feels. The fact that when you go to any, even the most modern office places, you generally just get given a printed out bit of paper, and maybe it's sticky. That's kind of the the advantage there. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting technology with a lot of great applications. So thank you for sharing with us. Now, for the next part, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Priya to do asking the questions and do the moderating. But just as a quick reminder, we're going to start off and talk broadly about standards of all shapes and sizes, because some of our panelists have mentioned already that they have, a lot of interests in different types of standards. It's not just standard essential patterns that is the concern for them. And then once we've done that, we will focus in on standard essential patterns, and that's where we'll talk about not only the concerns of the companies, but also some of the latest developments, like the court case I mentioned earlier, and some other recent developments that have happened too, including the IPO's SME questionnaire as part of their call for views. So yeah, Priya, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephen, and happy to be here. So like Stephen said, innovation operates on many standards. So my first question to the panel is, what are the standards that are important to your business and your product? And maybe, William, we could start with you.
As I've said to Stephen before, is I am wholly reliant on standards. It's the bit that I'm trying to patent is the fact of I've amalgamated so many standards into one device. So it is the being able to speak to operational equipment, as well as then being able to interface into the OT equipment. So it's how I capture and control sensors and actuators on big, heavy industrial equipment to the smallest machine, being able to then share that data across the factories with machinery that's made in different countries in different eras. So I'm reliant on the fact that they may all have standards, they may all be different, all the way through to how do I get it to a point on the internet where I can consolidate a whole bunch of information whilst keeping everyone's privacy, to be able to then build intelligent models from. So standardizing all the way granularly down to how we store data. And that's why part of our ethos is being heavily involved in the open source. So even our operating system we embedded on our advice is part of an open source community. So we work heavily with that. So hopefully that gives you a view of standards are everything. Wi-Fi, even to, as Brian mentioned, a QR code. They've all got some level of patenting and protection on them. And we have to navigate all those pieces to try to make it easier for people to implement what we're doing.
Absolutely. Stephen?
Yes, so for us in cybersecurity, especially in OT, the standards which we look to, one of them is IEC 62243. So there are some that go for the ISO standards, which tend to be slightly out of reach of a startup like ourselves. So we've also found that some standardization that are applied by governments regarding cybersecurity approvals in EU were not ported over into the UK, so the UK has taken a much more light touch guidelines type of approach. And that has sometimes been hard for us to sell into the European markets because they don't recognize there isn't something anymore that is a sort of a stamp of approval that we can use to sort of say, yes, this has been verified by the NCSC or something like that, because they were quite afraid of it being used against them. So they sort of went for a different light touch approach. When it comes to SEPs, I must say that we haven't yet had as much experience as William and Brian have had. Not yet, because we haven't got into the size of, as I've been warned, because I was rather surprised to understand and learn more about SEPs and find out that this might be a serious concern that might affect us later on when we get recognized. So, and that's coming from myself as a technology lawyer who should know better about intellectual property issues. And has applied for patents and thought, I didn't realize that I'm going to have to pay somebody in future for something like this, because we're not infringing on somebody's patent, but we are using different, we have 100 essential components that we source and use within our technology. And we assume that everything that we get is what we get, and we don't have to pay anything more. I think that's going to be covered a little more, but I would just say that it is standards generally are something that are important for us in order to get recognition as a business, especially as a startup, trying to adhere to those, as long as they aren't overly cumbersome and require you to have a separate compliance team.
Absolutely. And, you know, you as a lawyer having to hire a lawyer is a testament to how many resources you have to use to be able to negotiate these standard essential patent licenses, and also just licenses in different areas of standards. Brian.
Well, I mean, the way I see standards, having worked in the telecom and networking industry all my life, basically, is they're like building blocks. If I when I go to see companies say, okay, here's a smart badge, this can help you digitize your processes, etc., etc., it's already a hard sell just to get them to see what they can do with the extra layer of technology I add. If I also said, and you'll need a whole new network system, and you'll need to put in this kind of radio, and this, if it was all proprietary to my device, then there's no way it would fly. So standards give me those building blocks. I can say, okay, you have a Wi-Fi network, great, we can use that. You want to use 4G, we can use that. You know, you have a LoRa network in place for your sensors, we can use that. So by having these standards, they're the building blocks I can stand on with my product to make it do a whole bunch of stuff. If I had to go and sell by myself or implement by myself and start from scratch, then there's no way I could, as a startup, get anywhere near a functional product. So if I don't have standards to be able to go and use my device, then I don't have a device. It's as simple as that. No standards, no business.
Absolutely.
I think the one word that I didn't use is essentially, like Brian, we have to have a huge level of interoperability. Yeah. So there's huge networks that somebody else has put all the infrastructure in. We have to marry up to that, or I've got nothing.
Yeah, no choice.
Absolutely. And to that point, and kind of relatedly, my next question is, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities that you have found in the standards that you have encountered? So William, we can start with you.
So what are the advantages of the standards, or what standards do I use? So if I kind of think that in a really specific granular way, that what we're trying to do at Manulytica is we're trying to abstract the data and the information from the existing control system. So we kind of went back to absolute basics with the design of, even in the 1960s, sensors transmit data through 2 or 3 basic ways of change in voltage or change in current, and then you have digital. Apart from that, there's not really much that's really proprietary. And so we roll back to at what levels do we keep scratching till we get back to, okay, actually we can work with those 3. We can work with those 3 really simply, and that gives us a fairly generic device that can work with those standards. And then we sort of built from there. It's always trying to work back to what's the lowest point we have to get to before we can get to a standard. So it's like, how do we stand up a Wi-Fi or a wireless network within a factory? What do we need to do? So point to point didn't work for us because it's noisy. So what other standards do we have? There's all these other people saying, oh, you could use thread mesh neck. They're all designed for different things. So we've had to build our pieces amongst that, but we're trying to always reach the lowest level of already accepted standard so that we can sell a product with minimum, as Brian said, bespoke technology into it to solve the, as Stephen sort of points out, cybersecurity is a big issue. And it's the fear of, well, how is that going to work with anything in the future? So that's our ethos. Go as low as we can to find an existing standard, build on top of it, and then where there's gaps, we fill that piece. And so that we're kind of trying to keep ours as interoperable and as generic as possible where we can.
Absolutely. Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, the advantage for us definitely, as I mentioned, as a startup, is the ability to get recognition when we're looking internationally. So being able to communicate across a common platform. So we look, Singapore is a big market for us, as is US. So being able to refer to those standards works very well as being able to, if you look at 62243, we're just at the asset manufacturing level, and there's others that have to fall within the other component parts. So being able to, I think it was Brian mentioned about the interoperability is extremely important. So having that, the downside, of course, is, as I mentioned, that some of the standards are simply too cumbersome, and that means that we're caught out. So it has to be a standard that's balanced, but not an overkill. Having been a lawyer in a practice, I know that lawyers with present company accepted that there's definitely a tendency towards creating something more that's a self-fulfilling work. We know that from Sarbanes-Oxley and things like that, that when you start putting in these standards, it seems to be like it's just created by lawyers and not by those who are running the business. What is essential?
Absolutely. And Brian?
I love the idea of standards being created by lawyers. But I mean, like I say, the opportunities with standards are the fact that you don't need to reinvent the wheel, and you don't need to necessarily, for the customer, tell him he has to install new kit because he's already got standardized kit. I think the issues quite often are that some standards are too complex, and there seems to be an evolutionary thing. You know, the too complex ones get superseded by something that people can actually use and get moving on. I think the other opportunity you have with standards is they give you this common basis, and you can innovate around the sides. You can say, okay, I have Wi-Fi, which is quite power hungry, but I can innovate by having something that uses Wi-Fi as a basis, for example, to wake up a very low power device. I can do wake up radio and innovate along the side of what is an existing standard. So standards give me a common platform. And then even if I'm not building part of my product, I can also extend the standard in my own way, because I know the way all this kit out there will have to adhere to the standard. So that gives me the basis. I know that everybody will be working like this, and therefore I can plug this hole here by working around that. And that's the big advantage of standards is, you know, the kit that's out there, I know how it's going to work. Something that's proprietary, maybe there's no documents, there's nothing to tell me, I have to back engineer it. And if the company that makes it decides to change it, then I'm out, I can't work anymore. A standard, if I know it's running Wi-Fi, then everybody has to build the same way, and nobody can change the ground under me and stop my product working, because then they wouldn't be standard anymore. So, you know, it's really the fixed rock on which I can build anything is the standard.
Absolutely. And, you know, Brian and William, you both said it very well. No standards, no innovation, right? You have to access those standards. That's it. And that's everything. And so, you know, the question here is, and obviously there are various different players in innovation, larger entities and there's smaller entities, and there's asymmetries in their equities and the resources that they have. And so my next question is, how important, and I feel as though I know the answer, but how important is an affordable and reliable access to these standards? Why don't we start with Stephen this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the access, and I saw also there was a question from the attendees about our ability to influence them as well, is connected, because we see the standards, and if we can shape them a little bit, and there's more industry input that comes across different sides, including SMEs, I think that they can be a bit more fit for purpose. So for us, there are some that are cost efficient, and there's some that are not. But they are useful and essential if they're fit for purpose. But we do need to be able to have some feeling of influence. We're relatively new to the market, so I can't say that we've had an opportunity to influence those standards, but we would like to and be a part of that process and feel that our voice is heard, and not just sort of pandering to the SME segment to check the box.
Absolutely. I think that's incredibly important. Well, Brian, why don't we, or actually, William, why don't we go to you, and then Brian will go to you.
Affordable, absolutely 100% for SMEs. We're always looking at cash flow. So if it's not affordable, we're out. It's an easy choice. And to give you some example, when you look at OT, the operational technology on heavy industry, it kind of becomes an interesting club, because I'm a member of the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, and I, as an SME, have almost no direct impact on the standards. But I do work with one of the large players in the organization, because they're one of my suppliers, and I can influence them. So when they're sat in front of the main panel, they can have influence. So I have to work through that sort of network. But with some of the OT standards, it is a closed club, that you have to join the club to be able to use the standard. Then you have to pay the license fee, and you have to pay an even bigger membership fee to be able to have a seat on the standards committee, to be able to influence the standards. So it's almost the how old the standard is depends on how it functions. So the sort of early stage 70s, 80s standards that have been around a while, there's a almost an economic infrastructure built around them. Luckily, that with this, the companies I've been working with, the suppliers, have noticed this is a problem, and I'll mention their name because they're really nice to me. Is Nordic Semiconductors. They do Bluetooth 2.4 gigahertz radios, Wi-Fi, 5G, all those different things. And they've realized this is a huge problem. So they've already been going out and negotiating with Nokia, with Samsung, with the others to say, guys, we believe that when we sell a product, our customers shouldn't down the road be caught out by the fact of there's some of your proprietary patented technology within our standard Wi-Fi radio, our standard 5G radio, because we need it to work. Let's work out a deal so that when we sell something, there's some pass-through SEP already done. So affordable is the multi-million-pound companies already starting to say, we'll have that conversation now, because an SME, when there's 2 or 3 of them, we just don't have the influence to be able to change the standard.
Absolutely. And Brian?
I think it varies, in my experience, wildly between the standard setting committees. Some standard setting organizations like the IETF are very open, and basically pretty much anybody with a technical interest can rock up and have their input. And it's very much about the technical merit of your input as to how it goes on. And others are a very closed club where, unless you're a national telecoms operator, you don't get to say anything about the standard. And I think there's big issues about that for SMEs, because that means that the companies who have the possibility to drive the standard in a particular direction do so, and obviously that's in the direction that suits them. And that's not necessarily the direction that suits either your user or your SME who wants to use the equipment afterwards. And that's why you end up sometimes with these standards look like they've been written by lawyers. Apologies to lawyers present, but they're so complicated because basically big companies are just trying to get all of their stuff into the standard. So you end up with this mishmash. IETF, which I've had experience with, it's much more, if it's not technically viable and reasonable, then it will get thrown out by the techies. The other standards can be very political. So there's both you have to pay to play sometimes in some of these standards committee, but also some of them it's extremely political who can be on them. And the ITU are an extreme example of that. And of course, that feeds into the whole telecom side and the 4G, 5G type thing. It's not just about how much money you have, it's also about what political influence you have. And some of that then comes back to, are you supported by your state? Is the UK government pushing to let SMEs have a seat at the table when we're talking about telecom standards? Or are they just listening to the big multinationals and being leaned on by them? So there's you're veering off into the political side of standard setting, and indeed SMEs generally are not taken seriously at that level, and that can be a problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think there's one of the pieces that we're working on, because sometimes the large companies, when they're writing something like the 5G standards, there's some pieces which seem to be, how did this slip through the net? Which is where we're looking at innovation, and there's pieces around the 5G. If you kind of get right to the back, you kind of go, this seems unusual. Why is there this standard in here? And I can't understand who else is using it. But I know there was a group that were involved in the standard that were thinking a completely different direction, and it somehow got included, which is what we're starting to exploit, because it is in the standard, so it will work, and it's covered by the 5G standard, but it's not going to be used in the same way we're going to use it.
It might have just gone in there in order that the said company can then say, but that means my patents are now set. And I can assure you there are definitely technologies in some of these standards where the only reason it's in there is to satisfy a big player, and the only reason they wanted it in there was so that their patented technology would be part of the standard. It's a game.
But it works great for me.
Okay.
Well, I'm very glad that you all brought up the development of a standard, because this is an important issue, right? And specifically in the context of standard essential patents, but also in technical standards, but also in the context of other standards. So I'd like to ask this question and maybe start with Stephen, because he brought up the fact that their business has not yet been able to participate in the development of the standard, in developments of standards, and they would like to. And I think that's a really important point to make. And why? So I'll ask the question. The question is, does your business or has your business been able to participate in the development of a standard? And how has that, if you've participated or not, how has that impacted your experience in the standardization process? And Stephen, we can start with you.
The answer is no, we haven't. As a startup, we're too early in the stage, but we would like to if we felt we had a genuine voice. But I think that if we take, for example, the pulling out of the EU standards from the cybersecurity angle and not replacing them and just leaving it as guidelines, but not having agreed standards, there seems to be just an acceptance of that, and that for us is a problem. I know why they don't want to go back to all of that regulation, but there needs to be some sort of ground for us to be competitive, and we'd like to see that come into place, and have a smart dialogue that's not so politicized about what it was EU, what was not, what was good, what was bad. It seems to be sort of, and we're getting lost in the middle. So we would really like to see some sort of standards of the cyber equipment being in place. Yes.
Absolutely. Brian.
Yeah, the standards forming is something that's very important. I agree with what you said, Stephen, about the UK environment changing at the moment, and the pulling out and the changing of the implication about cyber, but also other elements to do with standards. It's an opportunity, but also a problem. I'd say, as a company who use standards as a building blocks, it would be a problem if there were different standards in different countries that were wildly divergent. That would cause us issues in terms of being able to sell our products. If it's for one standard for the EU, a different standard for the UK, then that's going to be a problem. If the UK development of standards is influenced in one direction or a different direction, then already as an SME, I want to support the standard that covers the largest market possible. And therefore, if I can't influence how that standard evolves in a particular geography, like the UK, then that would be an issue. And at the moment, I don't really know what the way to influence any of that, how to be involved in those processes in a UK environment. Now it's separated from the EU environment, how that would happen. So there's a lack of information as well. I think I don't have the information on how to influence into that, how to affect those standards, how to see how they evolve going forwards.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And William?
I have had some minor influence on standards, partly with work that I was doing, but it goes back to Bluetooth, that they're in about to release version 1.1 of the mesh standards, and they've accepted some of the work which we've been doing around it, and obviously dealing with the other people in the community and saying, it'd be nice if we could do something like this. And obviously over time that feedback has got back, and they said, actually, it would be smart if we could do these things. And so the standard's developing because it's come in contact with the real world, and now they're getting feedback, and it's not, they're taking on board the SME. It's everyone who's using it's looking, saying, actually, we could improve it. But similar to what Brian's saying, we're trying to make something that's available to the global market, which is why it's always reduced down to the lowest level of standardization possible. Whereas there's do we use LTE-M or NB-IoT to move data? And that question only came around because we said, well, the UK hasn't implemented NB-IoT everywhere, but they've put LTE-M in, so we can build it for the UK market, but there's parts of Europe that don't have LTE-M in, but they've got NB-IoT. And then actually, when you look at somewhere like Africa, you go, they've got all of it because they're putting in new kit and it all works. And then you look at the US and they said, oh no, we're going all LTE-M. And like, how many different standards do I have to put in? Every time I have to adopt a new way of communicating, the cost goes up. I then have to look and say, I need a more either generic device, or I need to put 2 radios in, or do I need, oh my God, I need 3 radios, and the cost goes up. And how do I manage that one? Because I have to then worry about, do I need to do firmware updates, and how many different radios do I have, and who am I dealing? The complexity starts getting huge, and it's how do I build the smallest number of hardware devices, knowing the hard doesn't just mean it's physically hard, it's actually mentally and physically difficult to design and build these in the first place, with multiple standards. And I don't know about the other guys, but when I'm looking at building something, in the back of my head is Sony, Betamax, and Philips VHS going, choose the right one, because if I don't, everything you've done so far will just disappear because the standard will just evaporate. And so it's that hard thing of, I'm trying to innovate, but I'm trying to, as Brian said, just use those building blocks and put a bit on the side that I will support, that is supported by everything else that's going on, but I want to make sure I'm on rock solid ground. But then you open yourself up to the sort of center of the conversation around essential patents and other patented technology that's come in, as other people have said. That's where the standard committees all start to push in from.
Absolutely. And so we can see that at the baseline of innovation, just accessing these standards are pretty expensive. And so when we factor in the standard essential patents and the licensing of them, it adds a new element to this conversation. And kind of moving towards the standard essential patent side of things, my question to all of you is, how does your company assess if a standard essential patent licensing agreement that is brought to you is reasonable? And sometimes we can see this in the context of a FRAND commitment, which is, in some standardization bodies, require the standard essential patent holder to provide their license to a licensee on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms in exchange for a wider licensee base. So how does your business assess the reasonableness of the license? And do you think that you often have to accept unreasonable license just to gain access to these standards? William, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I alluded to earlier that I, as a small enterprise, have offloaded this to my component suppliers. Is the fact of, well, you've just got a bigger department to answer the phone for odd questions than I am as an organization. And luckily they know that it's not just me. They supply globally, and there's a huge amount of their customer base that's in the same position of, if we're going to sell wireless radios to manufacturers of electronic equipment, we don't want our customers to get caught out with there is no FRAND agreement in place, that they've already tried as hard as they can to get the best possible deal and leave it down to individual SMEs. So I already know, because I speak to them, that they're working really hard on this because this is key to their business model. Whereas if it was somebody selling you a 3D barcode scanner and it worked on all sorts of different scanners, are they pushing for my benefit? But I know that on the telecom side, that all the major radio manufacturers are all starting to say, well, we need to start to button this down, because if you're selling to mobile phone manufacturers and you sell a Bluetooth radio, if you want to sell it to Samsung, are you going to let Samsung have that fight, or are you going to try to take it on, because then Samsung will say, well, actually we're okay because we know there's Apple patents out there, and if you abstract us from that problem, it's better. So I feel relatively, not being a lawyer, I feel relatively protected because I'm putting some level of abstraction into it, knowing that I don't have to negotiate them. But they could, if I become that huge multinational, multi-million-pound organization, potentially they knock on my door and say, yeah, we want 1% of all this because this is a patent that you've been using for the last 5 years.
Absolutely.
Can I be the lawyer in
Please.
this? So, I mean, that's great that you feel protected at the moment, William. I think the difficulty is that depending on who the SCP owner is, they will not license to the chipset manufacturer. So they won't always license to your supplier.
Yeah.
They're always interested in the downstream innovation because there's additional value add, sells at a higher price point than the chipset, they can make more money. And that's what big issue at the moment in Europe and the UK and elsewhere as to whether or not someone like Nordic or someone in a component manufacturing position is entitled to a license. You know, we would say yes, they are, and they should be entitled to it because there's a FRAND commitment made. But again, there's a commercial element for SEP owners that they want to, or SEP enforcers that they want to get as much return on their SEPs as possible. And sometimes there's a comment, well, don't worry, we won't go after the component manufacturer, and don't worry, we might not go after the small companies. But from a legal perspective, until you have a license, until you can say to your investor that you're clear for all these rights, you're in a sticky position. And I think that all then goes back to the policy question is, where's the most efficient place to license? It'd be what Nordic is trying to do for you, and that's where it would be. So I'm going to stop talking and then let Brian and Stephen chime in on this.
Thank you for being the lawyer. And they think about it in terms of they're in the middle of the EU, and so they're trying to work it that way.
Absolutely. Stephen?
Oh, well, until Brian and William told me what these things were, I didn't know that I even had this issue. So all I can say is I haven't had any experience, but I guess I better put something in the budget for it going forward. But I'll certainly consider William's approach. Sounds like the only way to manage it from an SME perspective, taking into account legal view, that might not be the only way. So future me issue at this stage.
Absolutely. And Brian?
Yes, unfortunately, I have to agree with the lawyer that until you have a license, you don't have a license. I think SEPs and the whole issue of SEPs and FRAND is completely broken. In my opinion, the system is irredeemably broken currently. There is no way it can work in practice because as you say, I buy my chips from Nordic, I buy chips from Sequens, I buy chips from Qualcomm. It doesn't really matter who I buy them from at the moment. I have no license to use them. Even if I wanted to get a license and say, okay, I want to be 100% legally covered, the work required for me to go and say for each of the standards in this box, for me to say, okay, what are all the chips I have in here? What are all the standards adhere to? What is the intellectual property that then covers? What are the patents? Even the ones that are just declared as SEPs. For me to say, what is the list of all of those? Find the rights holders for every single one of those and go and negotiate with them. My life wouldn't be long enough to do that. So there's no way for an SME, I would say, reasonably to say, yes, I have a license for every piece of technology in this box. Whether or not I even use that particular corner of the standard that the SEP applies to, that doesn't really matter to the SEP owner. There is, in practice, there is no way for me to legally say, I have the right to sell this product. So for me, the whole system is, it's just, unworkable as it is at the moment. So the whole SEP system, even without the FRAND concept, is just broken because there's no way for me to know who to go and find and say, I need a license. So the only recall for me is to say, it must be that the lowest implementing component, because they know what they're implementing, but they have to, work out what the licenses is. And even for them, I understand why Nordic don't do it, because it's for everything, because it's just very hard for them. They're not that big a company, and then they have run into the SEP holders who then say, we're not going to license you because we think we can make more money going after the end user devices, the end user systems, because they have more value, and the percentage of that will give us more money. So my opinion on them is probably not repeatable in a public forum, but for me as an SME, there is no way that the current system can work. I cannot legally get to a point where I can sell my device if I take all this into account.
Yeah,
it's broken.
And then you think that you have to have, because you've got radios in there, you've got all these international certifications that you have to work with, and if the SEP licensee doesn't allow you to use the chipset in the way it's already been built, your certification then it's useless. So I can get FCC certification, and if the chipset doesn't allow the SEP or FRAND to agreement that's from the chipset to be passed through, I can't legally sell it because it's not certified either.
Yeah, the current system does not allow me as an SME to use the system.
Absolutely.
I don't have a cat, but I do have a daughter.
Yeah.
Who brings me coffee?
I've got one of those too.
Well, thank you guys for that. I think that really the discussion on this really highlights the uncertainties on the SEP landscape. And there are so many uncertainties worldwide on the SEP landscape, but also within the UK. And I would like to turn it over to Ansley to kind of give us color on that. What's happening in the courts? And then also, we have the SEP, the SEP issue kind of encompasses not just IP, but consumer welfare, competition. And so all of these regulatory agencies in the UK are also grappling with this issue. So turning it over to Ansley to kind of give us some color on that.
Thank you so much. Before I launch into my comments, although I already did because I couldn't help myself earlier, these comments are my own and don't reflect my firm or any clients. This is all me, unadulterated. And I'm just really glad to be here because this is so important. And, I'd rather have everyone from SMEs be having this conversation and continue this conversation, because this is really where the focus should be, because it gives us the potential to analyze and create policy that promotes and attracts innovation for British business, particularly SMEs. And listening to these stories today really brings alive the real live issues and the real people behind these issues that are being affected by what I call respectively the vacuum of SEP and FRAND policy in the UK. At the moment, the landscape is very much one that is set by the courts in litigation between companies, mostly big companies or companies who have large company backing. They're not with SMEs. But SMEs are still involved, as I'm sure Brian will have experienced as well. The UK government has not yet created or implemented a policy position yet. They created the call for views, which we were very happy to see. And more recently, they launched the SME survey as part of that. So again, another plug for all SMEs to look at that and to respond to it, because your views are really important to this conversation. And maybe we could get a little bit more time in doing that because it's over the Easter holidays, so there's not a lot of time to respond. So if anyone knows anyone in the IPO, that would be my ask, so everyone can have a kind of a quieter Easter holiday. So far the courts are making the policy. They're very specific on the facts between the parties, dependent on the parties' commercial objectives as to what arguments they run. And so far we've had 2 FRAND judgments. We've had the Unwire Planet judgment, which confirmed that UK courts have jurisdiction to determine the global FRAND rates for an entire FRAND portfolio. And if the party does not enter into that court-determined license, they will be injuncted or excluded from the market. Then we've more recently had the Interdigital and Lenovo case, which wasn't as earth-shattering in terms of the main policy, but there are interesting comments on the landscape, which are both good for potential implementers and not so good. But the net effect with all of these decisions is that there's not a coherent macroeconomic policy coming from the courts. And that's fair enough. That's not their job. They're there to adjudicate in an adversarial process between two parties on the facts of that case. They're not looking at how does this case in IDC and Lenovo affect Brian or Stephen or William. That's not what they're thinking about. And that's why we're so glad that the IPO is looking at this issue, because we want to take a bigger look at what this environment looks like. And just to take the IDC Lenovo decision, which came out recently, I'm not going to get into the facts of this. It's, again, specific to the facts, but there were some interesting comments that are coming out as to why there is kind of an incoherent policy and why there's some things that are not being recognized as to what's really going on in the innovation landscape in the UK. There was a recognition that there is a practice by at least IDC and probably other SEP owners that they will go to a small business and they'll say, here are the rates. And those rates are usually the published rates. Sometimes they're even higher than the rate card rates. And they say, enter into this license. And for most small businesses, they will say, okay, fine, because they just don't have the time. They don't have the time to negotiate. They don't really have the resources to end up in litigation. So there might be, a little bit round of communication, but generally they're getting higher rates than what the big companies end up getting, because the big companies are used to this. They have whole legal teams devoted to it. And if they're getting unreasonable demands, they will go to court, and they can afford to spend millions and millions of pounds litigating what this rate should be and whether or not they even have to have a license. And so what then happens is that the SEP owners, they get these high rates with the smaller businesses. Then this becomes part of their comparable licenses. The comparable licenses, they say, well, a bunch of companies have entered into a X percentage royalty rate, which is very nice and high and lovely for me. So therefore you should also enter into that. And so they will do that with other smaller companies. And then the other smaller companies will say, okay, fine, here we go. And then what happens is that they'll take those comparable licenses with small companies and they'll go to the big companies and say, okay, well, I already have 7 licenses at this rate. You should be entering into the same rate. And of course, the big companies will say, nah, I don't think so. This is really too high. But when they say that it's really too high, what that means is that the small businesses have entered into too high of a FRAND rate for their company. And although the initial cost savings of I'm not having to do a lot of negotiation, I'm not having to go to litigation, I don't have the risk of being pulled off the market, I don't have the management time suck when I need to be devoting it to building the product and building the business. That might come back to haunt them later on when their business is scaling up, when these people come knocking on their door, once that license expires. So there was a recognition that this is a practice that does happen. We know that does happen. And although there was that recognition, the court judgment doesn't do anything about it. Why would it? The small company was not involved, but yet this is where we need some policy intervention, because this is not a sustainable landscape. And there were also comments from the judge that are, again, problematic for SMEs. There were 2 issues in specifically, which was ignoring past limitation periods. So for the non-lawyers amongst you, when you claim, you get 6 years back. So 6 years from the action, you don't get to claim for money that's beyond that. Most companies have a 6-year limitation. Most countries have a 6-year limitation period. But the judge said, well, if you're really a willing licensee, you should be willing to pay for all your past infringement, even if it's past the 6-year period. So that could be quite a bit of money, especially for a small business who are trying to build up. And so they might not be super attractive to sue or push towards litigation until they're bigger and well established. Well, this comment by the judge said, well, you still might be on the hook for everything that came before, even if it's past 6 years. It could be 10 years, 15. Who knows what that limit is? I mean, despite legally, this doesn't make any sense to a lot of lawyers who read this. It is very worrying in terms of what that could mean, particularly for a small business. And the second issue that was raised was that in order to show willingness as a willing licensee, you would need to look at the Etsy database. For example, we're in the Etsy world with this judgment. Everyone on both sides has acknowledged and accepted the Etsy database is not very good. It's not very clear. It's not up to date. You don't know what parts of the standards are protected by the patent in question. You can have general declarations which don't mention any patents or any standards. They'll just say we have patents essential to all of 4G. What am I doing with that? I might not use half of those patents, but yet I'm supposed to be, I haven't, it's ridiculous. But apparently under the world, according to Mr. Justice Meller and IDC and Lenovo, you should be looking at the Etsy database, seeing what you might have to use, approaching the SEP owner, and then setting money aside. Now, as William said earlier, you're a small company, cash flow. Hello. I mean, what are you doing with this money? If you have that money, you're spending and investing it into your company to build, to grow your business, to grow your products, to innovate. And the problem with this is that for both of these, he said, these are signposts of a willing licensee. We have now from the courts case law that says if you are not a willing licensee, you might be injuncted and off the market. So the question is, if you don't do these two things as a small business, are you now unwilling to be injuncted, even if you commit to take a court determined license? So this is, again, this just illustrates that courts should not be making the policy because they're not looking at the issues that Brian and William and Stephen have just gone through. Because when you look at those sections of the judgment, they don't match to the lived experience of a small company. There was, of course, some positive recognition. The judge acknowledged that a lot of the premium value in the end user product has nothing to do with the SEPs. Because the SEPs, as we know, especially in, for example, in a mobile phone, is in the baseband chipset. There's a lot of additional value that has nothing to do with the SEP owner's IP. And again, but that's important. So that's something, you know, we should think about. We were talking about that earlier about where is that value and where should there be efficient licensing, you know, thinking about it being at the component level and not downstream. So just in summation, I think the key point that, you know, from my perspective is that the UK policy needs to focus on what is productive and will propel innovation and support SME growth. You're not going to get policy answers from judgments like this. Yes, there's some interesting comments, but again, this is inter partes. It doesn't look at the wider ecosystem and issues. And ultimately, things like chip level licensing for SMEs, which increase efficiency, reduces uncertainty, gives you assurance. So you can focus on what, you know, the UK economic policy should really want you to do, which is to innovate and grow business in the UK and not to grow business of litigation. Although that might put me out of a job, it's better for the UK economy. So I'm going to stop talking there, but that's a little update from the UK.
Thank you so much, Ansley. And I think that gives everyone a lot to think about, obviously. And the biggest point, you know, is that the SME experience has to be heard, and that has to be pulled into the policy. And policies that surround this specific landscape have to be defined and clarified for these SMEs. And I'm sure Ansley has given you a lot to think about, but to the businesses that we have here on the panel, what concerns specifically about standard essential patents do you have for your business? And then I want to also throw it to Ansley to maybe kind of give those highlight points as well. So William, I can pass it to you.
So I think Brian summed it up earlier fairly clearly. Yeah, I could look through the patent database and try my best at seeing if I can find who has one, which is why you have to pay a professional to do a search on there for when you make your own patent claims, because I have no idea which ones are relevant or not relevant. So even finding all the areas that might have patents on pieces that I don't know that I may or may not be infringing, you kind of think that the only way you can get through this is almost through blind ignorance. It's because it is virtually impossible to find out who owns every piece of intellectual property that you might be stepping on. The other really essential part of trying to make Britain a high-tech, high-wage economy is it needs lots of inward investment. In order to do that, you can imagine the pitch. I go for my round and I say, I need 1.2 million. And they say, what are you going to do with that? And I say, about half of that is going to be sat in a vault just in case there is an issue with one of the patents that I may or may not have realized that I have potentially infringed. And the comment back from your investor will be, are you joking? It goes down on the risk register, and the risk register says, I might be infringing somebody's intellectual property, which may mean there may be possibly an infringement in the future, which could be backdated. And I have no way of mitigating that risk right now. I can say I've done searches on the databases and all the rest of it, but I have to put in there, I have no mitigation for this. I don't have any money put aside because I have no understanding of how big that value will be. And I have no way of knowing if I'm infringing them until there is a predatory case against us to say, you've been infringing the rights. And if you want me to innovate, and I'm always looking over my shoulder saying, I've got to put a pot of money aside in case I have infringed it, and you've not made it easy for me to work through that, I will just not bother doing it in the UK. I will go to another country which will support me doing it. And that's, we can, with the globalized world, I can set up manufacturing in Spain, Yugoslavia within a couple of weeks. It's not hard.
Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, 100%. That's the viewpoint. I would say that the courts are definitely not the right place to be making these judgments, as you said, but equally, the patent system needs some reform, and the standard system needs some reform. I would divide patents as patents that on things that are proprietary, and if I'm doing a proprietary thing and there's a proprietary patent, then I deal with that myself. SEPs, when it's a standard, then the standard setting body has to take its responsibility seriously. And instead of going, oh, well, we'll just do a call for anybody involved in standard to say, oh, I might have a SEP, I might have a SEP. And then we just say, yeah, the SEPs. Instead of that, the standard settings body should be called to account by the government, who are the end user on this, and say, okay, if you're setting a standard, if you're a standard setting body and you say there are SEPs on your standard, then you as a standards body are responsible for making sure that the issues around those SEPs are sorted out before you can issue version whatever of your standard. If you want to have 5G and say it's 5G as a standard, then the defining committee has to be able to say, here's a list of all the SEPs. We have validated that these SEPs are actually essential. We have validated that these patents are actually reasonable, and there's a hell of a lot of patents out there that are just nonsense. Somebody once told me, to get a good patent, the only thing you need to get a patent is not a good idea, you need a good lawyer. And there are a lot of patents cluttering up that database that don't meet the criteria for being patents. So the standards committees need to be told by the states, by the EU, by the UK, if you want to issue standards that we're going to support nationally, then you have to clean house and make sure that these so-called SEPs really are both essential and patents. And then you also have to fix the FRAN thing and say, all of these SEPs we have identified, there's nothing else, and the rate for this, and the standards committee say, to be a Wi-Fi standard, you have to say, it's licensed like this and the rates are this, before you issue it as a standard, before some poor guy ends up in court and starts finding himself that he's the test case and he's running lawyer bills of millions of pounds. And that's where the government and the IPO can step in, because they have the state authority to fix some of these issues before it gets to the courts. So I would say fix it at the source of it, which is the standards committees and the IPO and the government. And the UK government now, of course, have an opportunity where they are able to act freely, and they could start fixing some of the things and therefore make the UK a very attractive place to do innovation if they start fixing some of these things coming from a state actor level.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Stephen.
Well, the one thing I would add to Brian, I'm glad for his optimism that he thinks the government can solve it before the court happens. I doubt that that's going to happen. And in terms of the little guy, I hope that there's a law firm out there that would act a little bit pro bono for a small law firm, or for a small company that was challenged by that, because I think it would actually bring a lot of political attention to this issue. So if anybody ever comes after me for an SEP, I will be the first one to resist and go mano against them, because this would be ridiculous, because we're a startup that's being supported, and we were actually I should state, we were recruited from Europe by the Department of International Trade to relocate to UK. So the Department of International Trade has in my view, an obligation to us because they incentivize us to move to UK, an issue which I constantly have to defend with my co-founder about why we're in this expensive jurisdiction. So I would expect to be well protected by the government and by the system, and I would like to see it happen, because that's the only way I think that there'll be attention to it, and I'm ready for a fight.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And Ansley, just any final thoughts here? I know we're kind of nearing the end, but happy to hear from you on this perspective.
Well, and I think there's an issue that I think Stephen and Brian and William all raised about the different landscapes in other countries as well, and what the UK is doing. And I think we have to be thoughtful as to that. They have issues such as certification and different standards and making sure they can sell their market, for example, in their products into the EU market. But also you might have seen today that there was the draft, the leak of the draft regulation from the EU Commission that's due at the end of April, which suggested that there could be a way in which the EU IPO actually administers a way of resolving these disputes. And putting burden on the SEP owners to register their SEPs and having a 9-month period before they could ever go off to a court. And I think there seems to be, without seeing the full draft of the regulation, there seems to be some messaging from the EU that, again, the courts are not the place for this. These need to be resolved in a more efficient way. But we need to also look at that from a policies perspective as to what we're doing in the UK, because if European SMEs can kind of benefit from a system like that, what are UK SMEs going to be able to benefit from? So I think we're, of course, very focused on the UK, looking at what opportunities there are for increasing innovation, but we also have to be very conscious as to, are we now going to be out of kilter with our nearest and biggest trading partner? And I think that international perspective is very important. That's it for me, Priya.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Stephen, off to you. Stephen Tulip, sorry.
Yeah, it's confusing having two Stevens, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, we're a little bit, it's time to wrap up, and I don't think I can add anything better than what the panelists have said. It's been really interesting discussion, and I think just underlines the fact that, you know, standards and standard essential patent licensing in particular is an important issue for small companies, and it is something that they worry about, and it is a problem that needs to be fixed. On the Q&A front, I want to point out that Daniel from BSI asked a really good question that Stephen kindly answered in text. Then he had some follow-up comments, which I've made so all of you attendees can see them. And I encourage you to have a look, because he made some really good points about how standard setting in the UK works compared to other jurisdictions. And he made the very good point that he wants it to be as inclusive as possible. So yeah, thank you, Daniel, for that. And we'll pick up that conversation after the event. But yeah, just last thing to say, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Priya for doing the hard work of moderating. And a final reminder, we've said it a lot, but if you haven't already, take a look at the IPO's SME targeted questionnaire on this issue. And if you are able to contribute, if you're the right sort of participant, if you are an SME, for example, please do take the time to do it, because it's a really important subject. So thank you all for your time, and goodbye.
Stephen.
Welcome. Goodbye.